So I want to spend a few minutes describing that narrative and then ultimately bringing this back to why are we teaching this new course. So it has to do with the fact that developing drugs is hard. Now, you probably already knew that, but I'd like to get into the details about why it's hard and in what ways is it hard. So this is the typical chart that you might see if you look up what drug development is all about. There are different aspects, different stages of it. We start at the very left with laboratory research, what Harvey does at the Whitehead Institute, Koch, Broad, and all of the other wonderful academic medical centers here in town. You're looking at various different chemical and biological compounds that might have some kind of a relationship to a disease. And you might start studying this in petri dishes and then move to animal models like mice or monkeys and so on. And that takes anywhere from 3 to 6 years. And once you have proven it in all of these other kinds of studies, you're now ready to take that particular therapy and put it into humans. That process is known as a phase 1 clinical trial. And typically, you're looking at putting it into anywhere from 20 to 100 humans. And assuming that it ends up being safe, you're not really focusing on whether it works. You're just focusing on side effects and toxicity. As long as it is safe and you've passed through phase 1, now you get to go to the next step, which is phase 2, which is 100 to 500 patients. And you're hoping that at this phase, you can see whether or not the drug actually works. And if it does, then you get to go to the next phase, which is phase 3, and now you're looking at between 500 and a couple of thousand patients. You're looking at a much broader population. And if that works, then you apply to the FDA for a new drug license, and they'll look at the data, and if they're satisfied, they approve it, you've got a drug. That process takes anywhere from 10 to, in some cases, 20 years. And it's fraught with 3 characteristics that really make biomedicine almost unique in the challenges that it poses to investors. The 3 characteristics are, it's very costly. Second, there's a very low probability of success if you're looking at it from the preclinical phase all the way to what's my likelihood of getting a drug approved by the FDA. And finally, as I said before, it takes a long time. We're talking anywhere from 5 to 20 years, on average about 10 to get a drug approved through this whole process. So it's difficult. And not only is it difficult, but it's actually getting more difficult. How do we know? Well, because of Ehrum's law. This is not really a law. I'll explain in a minute exactly where this comes from. This chart, if you take a look at the top panel, it's a downward sloping graph. What this is a graph of is the number of new drugs approved each year divided by the number of dollars spent in R&D in the pharma industry. So it's the number of new drugs per $1 billion of R&D spending. And it's been going down for decades. This starts in the 1950s up to the present. And it's called Ehrum's law for a reason. Does anybody know who Professor Ehrum is? You've never heard of him? There is no Professor Ehrum. Ehrum is Morse spelled backwards. This is the opposite of Moore's law, which says that we are becoming more efficient over time and packing more and more transistors per unit of chip. By the way, this graph is on a logarithmic scale. So this really is the opposite of Moore's law. And so as an outsider looking into the industry, I'm not qualified to say whether the industry is getting more or less efficient, but this is from industry insiders. And so my question is, well, why? Well, we just said that scientists and clinicians are getting smarter and better all the time. So why are things getting harder? And here's the insight that I came up with that I found totally counterintuitive, and maybe you will too. And it's that the very act of getting smarter has actually made things harder and riskier. So let me give you an example of that. All of you, I'm sure, have heard of this combination therapy, the idea of not using just one drug, but taking 2, 3, or in some cases 5, packaging together. The most famous example of that is the so-called AIDS cocktail. That's a group of 5 antiretroviral drugs, each of which doesn't work particularly well, but when you put them together into this combination of 5, it works like a charm, turning a deadly disease into a chronic but very manageable condition. Well, now that we know that combination therapies work, we ought to try them for all sorts of different diseases, right? In fact, there are some medical experts who claim that we actually don't need any more new drugs. We've got all the drugs we need. All we need to do is to figure out what the right combination of drugs are. So now that we know that combination therapies work, how hard could it be to try out various different combinations? For example, there are approximately 2,800 FDA-approved drugs on the market right now. So if you wanted to take drugs 2 at a time and look at what combinations might work for a particular disease, how many different combinations might you have to go through? Well, if you do the math, there are 3.9 million unique pairs, 3.6 billion triplets, and 1.4 quadrillion quintuplets. There is no way we could possibly go through all these various different combinations, and when you toss in other parameters like dosage regimens and biomarkers, side effects, and so on, you can see that it becomes just extraordinarily complex. Each of these combinations requires a separate and statistically independent clinical trial that takes lots of money, long time, with a low probability of success. But now that we know, now that we are smarter and we know that combination therapies work, we actually have a scientific and ethical obligation to think about this and explore the possibility of these therapies. So thanks to the brilliant minds that came up with combination therapies, life just got more complicated and riskier as an investment. So I want to talk about risk, and I'm going to give you 3 pop quizzes. For those of you who've taken introductory finance, I'm sure you can answer them. So this is for those of you who haven't had any finance exposure. I'm going to give you 3 quizzes to get you to think about risk and return from a very personal perspective, because it turns out that that's going to be key in understanding the science and business of biotech.